Well, welcome. In this video, we're going to be looking at something called a z-score. And what a z-score does is it enables us to be able to compare pieces of data within the same set to figure out how it compares to the other numbers in the set. Or we can also use a situation with z-scores to be able to compare two separate z-scores to figure out maybe how one person did on a test or one person did in a race versus another person. So we're going to be looking at some of these examples in just a minute, but first let's define how exactly to find a z-score. And that's described for us in this box here. So to find a z-score, it's a pretty simple process. You just take whatever your value is and subtract it from the mean, which gives you the deviation. And you take that deviation and divide it by the standard deviation. Doing so gives you your z-score. Now that z-score is going to tell you how many standard deviations, either above or below the mean, your particular data value is. So if you have a positive number, that represents that it's that many units or that many standard deviations above the mean. If it's a negative number for your z-score, it represents that many standard deviations below the mean. So let's look at some examples so you can see what we're talking about. Okay, in this first example, it says Nancy scored an 87 on a math quiz on which the mean score was 70 and the standard deviation of the scores was 8. So we want to figure out what is her z-score and tell how far her score was from the mean. So remember, the formula we're using is x minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. So in this case, her score was 87. So we're going to subtract from 87 the mean score, which is 70. So obviously 87 minus 70 would be 17, and divide by that the standard deviation, which is 8. So when you take 17 divided by 8, we get approximately 2.1 as our answer. So here's what that means. This means that her score was 2.1 standard deviations above the mean. And that's your answer. So why don't you guys try this now for Ned, who scored a 5.8 in a pop quiz in which the mean score was a 6.4 and the standard deviation was 0.9. So figure out what his z-score is and interpret that to see how far his score is from the mean. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and hit play when you're ready to check to see if you've got the correct answer. Okay, let's see how you did. You should have gotten negative 0.7 for your z-score. If you didn't get that, let's check your work. What you should have done is you should have taken his score, which is a 5.8, minus the mean score, which is 6.4. And it's okay that your result would be a negative number, because that just means that his score is going to be below the mean. And then take and divide that by the standard deviation, which is 0.9, and again you get negative 0.7. So it means his score was about 0.7 standard deviations below the average or below the mean. So now let's look at how we can use z-scores to be able to make comparisons. Let's look at this next example. Here we have, let me scroll down a little bit more here. So it says Mark scored 78 on a history test on which the mean was 71 and the standard deviation was 10. He scored a 68 on a chemistry test on which the mean was 62 and the standard deviation was 6. So we want to use z-scores to figure out on which test did he perform better compared to his classmates. Now, it's not just asking for which test did he score better, because you can clearly see that his history test, he did about 10% better than his chemistry test. But we're comparing his score to the rest of the class's score. So let's start out by looking at the history test. So on his history test, his z-score would be found by taking his score, which is 78, minus the mean, which is 71, and divide that by the standard deviation, which is 10. Well, 78 minus 71 is 7. Divide that by 10, and you get 0.7. So his score on the history test was 0.7 standard deviations above the rest of the class. So he did better than them. And on his chemistry, he got a score of 68. Let's do this. So he got a score of 68, where the mean in this case was 62, and the standard deviation was 6. Well, 68 minus 62 is 6, and 6 divided by 6 is 1. So his standard deviation was, or his z-score is 1, meaning that he had a score of 1 full standard deviation above the class's average, which means that he did better on his chemistry test compared to the rest of the class than he did on the history test. In both scenarios, he did better than the class, but in the chemistry test, he did better than the rest of the class by 1 full standard deviation, as opposed to the history test, which he did better than the rest of the class, or by the average, I should say, by 0.7 standard deviations. So that would be your answer, be his chemistry test. So that summarizes what a z-score is. So relatively simple concept there. So you should be able to get that pretty well. So why don't you guys now work on your assignment, and with that, good luck.